and today I'm going to be taking a gander at this little book right here called The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin. Ursula Le Guin was a very prominent science fiction and fantasy author, probably best known for her Earthsea series of books, but she had a 60-year career in which she wrote all kinds of novels and short stories and even a lot of essays. She was also quite the activist and feminist, and those tendencies showed up all the time in her writing. This was my first time reading Ursula Le Guin, and I was able to pick up on her sort of activist tendencies just from the premise of this book. So it centers on a guy named George Orr who has these dreams that have the power to change the world. And he's terrified of it, because if he were to dream something, like let's say pink dogs, he would wake up to a world that has always had pink dogs, and he'd be the only one who would remember any different. And naturally, there's a lot of destructive potential with a power like this. So while seeking help for it, he meets a guy named Dr. Haber. Only Dr. Haber doesn't want to cure him of this power. Instead, he wants to use that power to improve the world's many problems. Because the Lathe of Heaven takes place in this horrible dystopian future of 2002. And there's like this war in the Middle East, and there's over 7 billion people on the planet, and they're struggling to provide for themselves, and climate change is wreaking havoc. I can't imagine living in such a horrible future. So Dr. Haber uses a machine and hypnosis to try and control what George Orr dreams about. But as you might guess, the dreams always bring about a reality that's sort of ironic, or a very dark take on what they were asking or hoping for. Despite the interesting premise, I found the start of this book to be fairly rough. Much of the first 5 chapters consists of a lot of exposition and technobabble, and just like a lot of science fiction from like the early 70s, it's very much zeroed in on its own premise and concept, sort of to the detriment of other elements in the book. The characters are very simple, the dialogue is very wooden. It was really just that premise that was interesting enough to keep me going. And then it was maybe 60 pages in where we get our first big status quo change, and that's when I really got sort of invested in the story. From there, things start moving so fast that it makes your head spin. You've heard of jumping the shark? This book leaves no shark unjumped, okay? Like, things go completely off the rails, really over the top, but because it's all based on George's dreams, it suits the premise, and the reader ends up getting disoriented right along with George, especially towards the end. But at the same time, Le Guin is able to keep things focused on just 3 characters: George, Dr. Haber, and Heather, the love interest. And speaking of love interests, underneath the premise of this story and all of the fun, weird stuff that happens as a result of it, it's actually a fairly conventional plot. It reminds me a lot of like a monkey's paw type story, or one of those time travel plots where every time they try to improve something in the past, they end up making things worse somehow. And because the writing doesn't really capitalize on suspense or atmosphere as much as I would have liked, it ends up being kind of a middle-of-the-road novel for the most part. The thing that I ended up being most interested in with this book wasn't so much the surface narrative or the characters, it was the deeper themes that I found interesting. So Le Guin seems to be using this book as sort of a sounding board for feeling out her own sense of burgeoning social justice. You've got this strong message about how you shouldn't try to solve the Gordian knot of society's problems by imposing your own vision onto it. Rather, you should come at problems from this position of understanding and empathy. You shouldn't mess with things that you don't understand. And underneath all of that, you've got this very strong spiritual aspect underpinning the whole book. Almost every chapter in here is prefaced with a quote from one of the founders of Taoism. Taoism is sort of similar to Buddhism in a lot of ways. You can achieve enlightenment. It's all about like balance and harmony and connection with nature, stuff like that. I don't really know that much about Taoism, but I did read this westernized introduction to it called The Tao of Pooh, like years ago, and it actually went a really long way in helping me understand some of the more esoteric aspects of this book. One of the big metaphors in Taoism is that people should be like an uncarved log of wood. They shouldn't let themselves be carved by the impositions of society or peer pressure. So we see Dr. Haber trying to carve the world and George by imposing his own vision on them, and we see the results of that. And throughout the book, George is described as an uncarved block of wood, which I'm assuming wasn't meant to allude to how boring he is as a character, and instead meant to imply, like, how he should be as a Taoist. Another big thing in Taoism is this idea of the middle path, of not taking extremes. So in the book, you've got the extreme of this dystopian world versus the extreme of trying to control it through your own vision or whatever. And then you've got all these symbols and motifs about, like, harmony and balance and achieving enlightenment. You've got mountains featuring prominently, and mountains are traditionally the place where people would go to meditate or to try and communicate with the gods. Even the cover of my edition alludes to a lot of the book's spiritual themes. LeGuin is able to balance this idea of being part of a grand scheme of things with the idea of being an individual with agency. There's a lot about, like, our individual responsibility to the world around us and how we have a lot of power to change society, and how that's both a blessing and a curse depending on how you use it. Ursula Le Guin was writing this in the early 70s, which was a time where a lot of people in her generation were involved with activism, whether it be environmentalism or the hippie movement or the civil rights movement, and all of that shows up in this book. But like I said, it's clear she's still sort of feeling things out for herself, because a lot of it sometimes comes across as a little bit clumsy, a little bit dated. For example, this book acknowledges racism, which is great. One of the main characters is mixed race, but some of the ways that she's described borders on romanticization. But you can tell her heart's in the right place and that she's really trying to write effective fiction that's socially conscious. Years later, apparently, Ursula Le Guin would write some essays about her own early novels like this one, talking about how it would be a while yet before she really figured out how to best phrase all of these complex ideas she was grappling with. While I definitely enjoyed the themes in this book, that's just one aspect of writing, and the story and the plot and the characters were all a little bit lacking for me. So I guess she hadn't quite achieved nirvana yet and learned how to balance all these things in the grand universe of literature. There were parts that were very exposition heavy, the characters were quite flat. It's really just like the deeper ideas that this book works with pretty well. So at the end of the day, I come down at about 6 out of 10 on this, which is fittingly enough in the middle of the road. So once again, another sci-fi book on here that ends up being 6 out of 10. So I guess the next time I review science fiction on this channel, I should grab one of my old favorites so I can rave about it instead of just like nitpicking it for 10 minutes. But hope you found this video interesting nonetheless, and if you've read Ursula Le Guin, if you've read this book, I'd love to hear from you and share thoughts with you, because this is one of those books that's just sort of made to be picked apart and analyzed, if you know what I mean. So yeah, let me know, and until next time, I guess, see you later. Maybe consider subscribing and liking and doing all those things, but see you later. Bye!